Hey guys, Keith from Kiisu.Powerlifts here, and in today's video we're going to talk all about building my very own powerlifting slash deadlifting platform. Now before we begin, a full disclaimer, I have exactly zero handyman skills, so this video is not intended to be instructional in any way. I just wanted to document and ultimately give the reasons for what I did and the choices I made after watching a ton of other YouTube videos and reading a bunch of online articles. My video highlights what worked for me, why I made the choices I did building my platform, what mistakes I made, etc., etc. So again, this video is purely for entertainment purposes, not necessarily educational ones. Now that being said, the simple fact is that if I can build a platform, so can you. It's really not that hard, although some of the pieces are physically quite heavy. That aspect of it may require two people. But it's a great project to take on if you're looking to start your own home gym. I also wanted to explain why I decided to build a platform, why I didn't just put down some rubber mats and be done with it. Now for me, I'm a power lifter. And when you're powerlifting, especially when you're deadlifting, doing your lifts on a platform is just a really good idea. This applies to any type of lifting where the weight comes down with a lot of force, either because it's really heavy, like in powerlifting, or because it's being dropped, like in the Olympic lifts. A platform saves damage to both your equipment and to your floor. Rubber floor mats alone may not be enough to protect them. Now, if I was just into general fitness, then yeah, rubber mats alone would probably do it for me, but I needed to protect my garage floors. And the other thing I wanted to be able to bolt down my combo rack for safety reasons, so I needed something to bolt it to. Now, drilling holes in my concrete floors just wasn't an option. Those types of things tend to have an impact on the resale value of your home and or are going to be very costly to repair and fix later on. So all things considered, I went with a 3-layer 8-foot by 8-foot platform, but there are a lot of options, and you can go 2-layer 4-foot by 8-foot to 3-layer 8-foot by 12-foot, etc., etc. Just got to go with whatever size fits your needs. Needed items. Okay, if you're still with me, let's get into the details. And here's a list of the items that are needed for a 3-layer 8-foot by 8-foot deadlifting platform. You're going to need 4 sheets of 4-foot by 8-foot OSB, that's oriented strand board plywood, that is 3/4 of an inch thick. As a quick note, if your local suppliers are anything like mine, they may only have 23/32 of an inch thick, which is fine. Another note I wanted to mention was that when I was making inquiries about OSB plywood, I often get questions from the salespeople selling it asking why I wanted OSB. There seemed to be some concern that OSB might be too low grade for me, but the simple truth is that OSB is ideal for a platform. It's very durable, has a good shear force rating, and it's relatively inexpensive. So next up, you're going to need 1 sheet of 4-foot by 8-foot 3/4 inch thick hardwood for your top sheet. Now most people are going to recommend a hardwood like a maple or an oak or a birch, and personally I went with maple. You're going to need 2 3/4 of an inch thick rubber mats. Now these are usually sold in a 4-foot by 6-foot size, and you're going to need to cut these down. You're going to want to get something with a smooth or a crumble type of surface. Try and avoid something with a diamond pattern with crevices in it. That's just going to get dirt and dust, and it's just going to get stuck in the grooves, and it's going to make it really hard to clean. Now the other thing you're going to hear is that you should buy horse stall mats, and they're very popular. And they are, but I didn't go with horse stall mats. And the reason was is that the only place I could get locally that had them was a very long drive to get to, and the smell. Um, Horse stall mats are designed to be used outside. Now the smell will fade with time, but I'm not exactly a patient guy, and I just didn't want to have to deal with that. So luckily for me, I found a local fitness depot supply store that basically had exactly what I needed at the same price and a lot less smell. Now they have a crumble texture on it, but that's fine. You're going to need a box. I ended up getting 100 or so flathead countersunk wood screws, size number 8 and 1 1/4 inch length. You're going to need a power drill. You're going to need a 1/8 inch drill bit. You're going to need a screw head for the wood screws you've purchased. You're going to need an X-Acto blade or a cutting blade of some sort. You're going to need a straight edge, preferably with some measurements on it. You're going to need a white marking pen for your black rubber surface, which unfortunately I forgot to take a picture of, and finally a Sharpie for marking your drilling holes. I just quickly wanted to take a moment here to talk about cost. Now keeping in mind this is in Canadian dollars, Each of the sheets of plywood were about $70 each. The maple hardwood top layer was about $100. Each of the rubber mats was $75, so you add all that up, it's about $430 plus the miscellaneous stuff and taxes. You're looking basically at $500 all in for me. Now, this was a lot cheaper still than buying a dedicated Rogue deadlifting platform, for example, which after I priced it out was getting close to $1,000 with the tiles and the shipping and the taxes. And my personal deadlifting platform is a lot more versatile. So, for example, I can't bolt down my combo rack to a Rogue deadlifting platform. The only advantage I could see of the Rogue deadlifting platform were the band pegs, but I guess if I really wanted to, I could make my own. Now, this cost is a lot more expensive than even, say, 2 or 3 years ago. Lumber prices have just soared in recent times. You're going to find a lot of videos online talking about how sheets of plywood are going for like $25 US, and that's just not the case anymore. So those are the items that you're going to need, but let's go over a list of some of the optional items that you might want to consider. So if you want a logo like I did, then obviously you're going to need some paint and some paint brushes. And I'm going to suggest oil-based paint. It's just going to give you a nice deeper, richer color, although it will take a little bit longer to dry. You're also going to want some painter's tape. And at the same time, you're also going to need some way to print out your logo onto some paper at an appropriate size. You can use a home-based printer, or if you don't have that option, you can find a local print shop like Kinko's. You're also going to want a wide end Sharpie, which I don't have a picture of. Now the next option to consider is polyurethane. Now this is optional, but it is something that is strongly recommended, and obviously an applicator brush to apply the polyurethane. And this would be applied onto the top hardwood layer. Your platform is going to take a lot of abuse, and polyurethane is going to help protect that top wood layer and just give some added longevity and life to your platform. You're going to have all sorts of things calling onto it like blood and sweat and dirt and chalk, etc. You just want to make sure that that top layer is protected in some manner. As well, if you paint a logo on your platform, the polyurethane is going to help protect that logo by sealing it in. So definitely a good idea. Now, if you are going to use polyurethane, again, I do suggest oil-based polyurethane in either a satin or a semi-gloss finish, although the finish is a matter of personal preference. Remember that oil-based polyurethanes do take a bit of time to dry versus water-based, and there is also the smell factor as well, so make sure that you've got a ventilated area for that. Finally, you're going to need a sanding block, something in a 400 grit or so, and you're going to need a damp cloth. So what other options can we look at? Well, I would definitely try and find some wooden blocks of some sort. This will be very helpful when you're cutting your mats, as well as the number 8 1¼ inch wood screws. I try and find a box of number 8 2-inch wood screws, and you can use those on the top layer when you're screwing down the top layer pieces. You're going to want around 25 or so number 8 washers or a similar type of washer for the screws that are being used to screw down the rubber mats. That's going to help prevent the mats from popping through and coming loose when things are bouncing on them. You're going to need some black Gorilla Tape. And finally, if you are placing your platform on a concrete floor like I did, then it would be strongly suggested that you put a barrier of some sort between the cement and the plywood to prevent moisture transfer. And what I ended up using was some 6mm vapor barrier that was 8.5 feet wide. Now, why do you want to look at this? The reason is that concrete can retain a fair amount of moisture, and as temperature and humidity fluctuate with the time and the seasons, your concrete is going to absorb and then ultimately release water vapor back into the air. And when it releases it, that moisture is just going to go into wherever is on top of it. And in this case, if it's your plywood of your platform, then the plywood is going to absorb that moisture. Now, most plywood, including OSB, can handle some water absorption, but even the best can only handle so much before it warps, and then your platform is going to start wobbling. So if you have a vapor barrier of some sort, that's going to help prevent this. Okay, so that's what you need, and now we can get to work. So the first step that I did was I cut my rubber mats. Now ultimately what I needed was I needed 2 pieces that were 2 feet wide and 8 feet long. So to do this, I took each of the 4-foot by 6-foot mats and I cut them in half and divided them to get myself 2 2-foot by 6-foot pieces, and then I cut the remaining discarded parts down to give me my 2-foot by 2-foot corner pieces. So the first step was to just measure and draw a line down the middle of my 4x6 mats, and then using a straight edge and an X-Acto blade, you basically just have to cut and score through the mats several times until you cut all the way through. Now this can be very tedious. You might be tempted to try and use some sort of power tool to get this done, but I'll tell you, just use an X-Acto blade with a sharp blade. It takes a while, but it will get the job done very quickly, and this is where you're going to want to use a wooden block, and you're going to put that under the mat to help assist you. Gravity will help split the mat as you score it, and that was actually where I made my first mistake. I didn't use wooden blocks. I just basically tried to lift the mat up, which was probably not the best idea nor the safest, but I got the job done without cutting myself. But I also ended up with kind of jagged edges on my mats after I cut them, but that was fine. It was good enough for me. So after both mats were cut in half, I kept the two cleaner edged 2 foot by 6 foot mats, and those are going to be my long pieces. And then with the remaining mats, I simply measured out and created two 2 foot by 2 foot mats for the corners. Now you don't have to use the rubber in the corners if you don't want to. You could get some 3/4 inch plywood in a 2 foot by 2 foot section, but you're going to have the mats, so may as well use them. And basically that's it. The rubber mats are done, and you can move on to the next step. Okay, so the next step was to paint my logo and apply the polyurethane. So if you're not interested in that, that's not something you're going to do. You can skip ahead of a couple of minutes here. So to get the logo done, obviously the first thing was to print out the logo onto paper to an appropriate size. So personally what I did is I just simply took my logo and I opened it up in Microsoft Paint on my computer. And I printed it with the scale up option to the size I wanted, which in my case was just a 2x2 letter size piece of paper, so 4 total. And then using the borders that the logo came with, I just carefully taped them together to match them up. Then I put that down and I measured and I centered the logo onto the hardwood where I wanted it to be. I then taped down 2 of the corners and then just folded up the logo. And then underneath that, I just laid down painter's tape in strips in the area where the logo is going to be painted, and then put the logo back down and taped the 2 corners so that it was held in place. Now at this point, you're going to want to use your X-Acto blade and hopefully your straight edge, and you're going to carefully cut out the logo. Now you need to make sure you've got a good sharp blade here and that you're cutting deep enough to cut the painter's tape that's underneath the logo. Now I had a combination of straight edge and curves, so obviously with the straight edge I used the straight edge, but you may have to freehand a little bit if you have some curved areas. And so long as your blade is sharp, this really shouldn't be a problem, but obviously when you're dealing with an X-Acto blade, you want to be careful and you want to take your time. Just don't rush and do it properly. Once the entire logo was cut out, I used a wide edge Sharpie pen just sort of to draw in the edges of the logo, just in case the painter's tape didn't, or the painter's tape didn't want to come up, and I just needed to know where the edges were. But fortunately for me, the painter's tape came up quite easily, and once I had the wood underneath exposed, it was just painted in. Now again, I used an oil-based paint to give myself that really nice deep red color that I was going for, but you are going to need, if you do use an oil-based paint, you do need to let that dry for quite some time, preferably overnight. You don't want to risk the paint scratching off if it's not quite set when you're doing the rest of your work on it. So once it's dry, you carefully remove the painter's tape, and that's it. That's your logo underneath. Now the next step for me was applying the polyurethane, and this is where we get into the second mistake I made. I did this work in my garage, and I didn't open up the doors. It was cold out and I didn't want to get too freezing in there, but I should have opened up the garage doors because polyurethane, especially oil-based polyurethane, stinks and has very actual toxic fumes. So when I did my first coat, I had the garage doors closed, and I gotta tell you, by the end of it, I was quite nauseated, and the other problem was that it stunk up the rest of the house, which didn't make me very popular. So make sure you do this in a ventilated area. Once the polyurethane is ready to go, you want to sand down the wood just very lightly. You don't have to scrub or anything. You just want to give a little bit of an abrasive edge on it, just so that the polyurethane's got something to grip to when it's drying. Now, after you've sanded, you want to wipe down the entire surface that you sanded with a damp cloth. And this was the next mistake that I made when I was trying to get rid of the dust created by the sanding. I just tried to use a sweeper broom, and just what happened was I just ended up with a lot of dust under my polyurethane, which I couldn't see, but once I started painting over it, oh, I could see it quite clearly. So, whoops. So definitely use a damp cloth to carefully wipe away the sand dust. After you wipe away the dust, you just apply the polyurethane. Now remember, if you are using an oil base, this is going to need preferably overnight to dry, at least 8 hours. Um, don't rush this. You want the polyurethane to cure properly. Now, I've heard anywhere from 2 to 3 coats. I personally did 2 coats. I did a very light coat, and then I did a bit of a heavier one after the first one had dried. And the second time I applied a coat of polyurethane, I can tell you I had my garage doors open. Learned my lesson there. And finally, the other thing to remember when you're using polyurethane, especially oil-based polyurethane, is that the oil in the polyurethane will give a yellow tint to your coloring. So I'm going to provide you with sort of a before and after of how it looked, so you can see the difference between them. I mean, I personally really liked how the coloring came out, but it can change the color of your logo, so it is something to keep in mind. And so finally we can now begin to assemble our actual platform. Now, before you begin, remember that you're going to want to assemble the platform in the location that you're going to be using it. A 3-layer 8-foot by 8-foot platform like this weighs in at just under 500 pounds. So this is not something you're going to be able to pick up and carry it to a new location if you change your mind about where it is. So make sure you've planned out the location properly. Before you begin assembly, make sure that the area underneath the platform's home has been given a good sweep, and make sure the area is dry. If you're using a vapor barrier, you want to lay down your vapor barrier first and make sure there's a good 3 to 4 inches of extra plastic on the side. Now my vapor barrier was 8.5 feet wide, so that was perfect, and I just had to cut the other length to fit exactly with my X-Acto knife. Place 2 of your OSB plywood boards on the floor. You might want to check to see if there's a side down labeled on them. Lay them down in the same direction with how you want your finished platform to go. Then lay the other 2 OSB boards on top of the first 2, but perpendicular. In other words, lying in the opposite direction of the first. Now remember that OSB plywood is not a precision cut piece of wood, so you're probably going to have some overlap on your edges. Do your best to align them, but they're never just going to line up perfectly. Now some people are going to suggest that you use glue to hold them together. I personally didn't use glue, just in case repairs were needed later on. And so for stability, I used extra screws instead. Once you have your plywood aligned as best you can start to drill your pilot holes. Start by measuring a spot in each corner 2 inches from both edges, then measure out locations for your other holes, marking the spots with a Sharpie. Now most suggestions I've seen were for the screws to be about 18 to 24 inches apart. I ended up personally going around 15 inches apart. It's a bit of overkill, but I'd rather err on the side of caution. Just remember to keep the screws 2 inches or so from the edge as you go around. Now that the first 2 layers are secured together, if you're doing the vapor barrier option, you want to lift up the plastic overlap and tape it down with Gorilla Tape on top of the second layer. Now the edges are going to be easy, and for the corners, just fold them together like Christmas wrapping and then tape those down as well. Now your first 2 layers are complete. Now you want to carefully measure out and position your top pieces so that your rubber mats and your top layer are hardwood, and then you're going to repeat the drilling process. You're going to measure your pilot holes, you're going to drill your pilot holes, and then you're going to drill in your screws. If you have 2-inch number 8 screws, this is the time to use them. Otherwise, 1 1/4 inch screws will be just fine. Now as a personal preference, I did leave a bit of a screw gap where the plates are going to be dropped when I'm deadlifting. This is just going to help prevent my plates from being chipped, and I use some tape to secure that area down instead. If you have number 8 washers, make sure that you use those when you're screwing down the rubber section. Using the washers is going to help to prevent the screws from popping through the rubber. Finally, use a bit of Gorilla Tape to help seal down the rubber seams or the joints where the rubber's been cut. This is going to help with cleaning. And that is it. You are done. So just a quick addendum I wanted to add, as I've now had my setup for a couple of months, and I'm sure you're wondering if there was anything else I discovered after the fact. And the one thing I wanted to mention is that if you are building your platform in a garage, you may need to be prepared to deal with a slope. Now, by code, most garages will slope towards the garage door, and this helps in the case of a flood. It just helps get the water out of the garage. What this also means is that if your platform is on that slope, your barbell is going to roll towards you when you're trying to deadlift. Now, when I researched this later on, a lot of people were talking about how they built their platforms with gradients built into them and they measured it all out. And honestly, I'm just not that sophisticated, and honestly, neither was my solution. What I did is I took some of the leftover vapor barrier plastic that I had, and I carefully cut out some squares with my X-Acto blade, and I folded it up into a smaller square with a bit of height to it. I then very carefully unscrewed the rubber mats, and I placed the plastic underneath the rubber to create a little stop gap right where I wanted the bar to sit when I was deadlifting. Now, it's not sophisticated, but it does work. And that's it. So thanks again for watching, and if you have any questions, please just leave a comment below and I'll answer it as best I can. Please remember that whatever weight you lift, just love to lift it. So thanks again, and we'll see you next time.